All right, so thank you and welcome to the first GTR webinar live with Juana Watkins. We're very excited to welcome her today to discuss fair housing as this is April, Fair Housing Month. So before we get started, I do want to welcome Ms. Shar Kanech with Brown and Associates Law and Title. She is one of our Platinum Affiliate sponsors, and she's just going to give you guys a little bit of information about what she can do for you. With that, take it away, Shar.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Grace. As Grace told you, I'm with Brown and Associate Law and Title. As we know, the landscape of real estate industry has changed drastically for all of us. I was going to say most of us, all of us in the last couple weeks. I'm sure that everybody has heard the buzzword electronic signatures and RON and e-signatures. We are all implementing those into closings. However, it takes everybody on board until all the lenders are also have implemented these electronic signatures. Oftentimes, they can't be used. Sometimes we could get almost all of them done. The ones that are notary signatures still have to be done wet. We're doing everything we can as title agents and title people to abide by the CDC guidelines. The staff, most all of our staff is working from home. However, we're there to do closings, and we've got all the rules in place. You typically will wait in your car until we call you and come in one at a time. Bring your own pen, or we'll give you a pen that's all wrapped up. Everything is, sterilized, and everything's wiped down after each and every customer. We also abide completely by the 6-foot rule. They again, we take each client in one at a time to do the signatures, unless it's husband and wife, but the chairs in the conference room will be at least 6 feet apart. There will be hand sanitizer at the counters. Oftentimes we're doing mobile closings. Just remember, when you're asking for a mobile closing, we can make sure that our work environment is up to code. If you're asking for a mobile closing, we have no control over where we're going. So keep that in mind. So if we're doing a mobile closing, tell us where we're going, make sure that we have contact with the people that we're closing with, and we can abide by the rules. So about Brown and Associate Law and Title, if you don't already know about us, we have real estate attorneys who are very experienced. We have a seasoned title agent. We would love to help you with your closing. We're up and we're open, and we're doing everything we can to abide by all of these rules. So we're lucky we're in a business that's deemed an essential business. We're going to keep everything going, and thank you again for this. If you have any questions for me, I'm sure that you'll have my contact information. Just reach out. I'm here. I'm working at home like everyone else, and I'm here for you. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you so much, Shar. Again, that is Shar Kanech with Brown and Associates Law and Title. So now I'm very excited to introduce our speaker for today, Miss Juana Watkins, who is a native of Pensacola, Florida. She's a graduate of Florida A&M University and Florida State University College of Law. Juana began a career in law as an attorney for the Orange County Public Defender's Office, but discovered a love for the real estate industry after joining DVPR as a senior attorney. Over the next 16 years, she went on to serve as the chief attorney and deputy director of the Division of Real Estate before an appointment by Governor Rick Scott to director for the agency for nearly 7 years. Juana has worked for Florida Realtors, first as senior counsel from 2005 to 2008, and recently as interim director for executive offices and associate general counsel. Presently, Juana serves as vice president of law and policy and general counsel for the Florida Realtors. With that, I would like to introduce Ms. Juana Watkins with our Fair Housing Forecast.
Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, if you've ever heard me present to one of our local associations, I always say that I am the luckiest person to do this job. And I mean it as sincerely this time as I meant it the very first time I said that. The other thing I want to do is to offer kudos to Tampa. These are uncertain times. And initially, I was trying to figure out how am I going to do this? We have so much going on. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to slow down and just remember that we are open for business and not everything is going to be COVID. We need to take a moment to realize that we have to continue to enrich ourselves as a profession. And so I'm really thankful for the opportunity to help you today to commemorate fair housing. I said commemorate and not celebrate. And let me tell you why I said that. Because although we do have lots to celebrate as an industry, we've come a long way since the inception of the Fair Housing Act. We have learned recently that while we can celebrate, there's still work to do. And so I want to talk to you about something that you probably have all heard recently. Vince Malta was at our convention and talked about this and committed that as an industry, we're going to focus on this. And so despite the detour that we've taken with COVID, I'm really glad that we've had an opportunity to come back to this very important topic. So that said, let's talk about fair housing. When I mentioned that you've probably heard about this issue recently, it is because in January, and actually the actual publication came out in November of 2019, a news outlet called Newsday published a finding that they had for an undercover investigation that went on for 3 years. And in that undercover investigation, they went into various real estate offices in the Long Island, New York area, and they used testers to determine that Long Island, New York has a problem. And so here's what they found as a part of this investigation. Newsday sent in what they call pair testers to assess whether or not there would be differential treatment in terms of how minority groups were treated in brokerage offices compared to the white testers that they sent in. So what they did was, when you use a tester, I'm going to talk about this testing process a little bit, but when you use a tester, you find, and when you use pair testing, you find people who are similarly situated, almost exactly the same, except for their race. Same kind of credit score, same income level, same desires in terms of the types of houses that they're inquiring about. And they would first send in the tester for the minority group. And they go into the office and say, hi, I'm Juana, and I'd like to see a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in this price range. They would literally video record the response to the African American, the Hispanic, the Asian tester. And then they would send in a white tester, same request. And they documented the difference in treatment. What they found, and let me stop right there and just say, Florida is a 2-party state, so do not get any ideas about going out and videotaping people's offices. Okay, so don't be Newsday. You have to have permission to do that here in Florida, not so much in New York. Okay, so let me just put that there just in case anybody get any ideas to go out and investigate. But here's what they found. In 19% of the instances, Asian applicants or buyers were treated differently. Hispanic buyers were treated differently 39% of the time, and 49% of the time, African American buyers were treated differently. Now, what kind of different treatment did they observe? Well, they saw things like requiring mortgage pre-approvals for the members of the minority groups that they did not require for others. So I go in, I say, hi, I'm Juana, I'm looking for a 3-2. They'd say, well, we're happy to help you, but you have to be pre-qualified first to show your ability to purchase. The white tester goes in looking for a 3-2, and they say, absolutely, when would you like to go? Okay, so putting that barrier, that additional hurdle in place for the minority tester. The other thing they would do was steering, which we've heard before. And what that means is they'd say to the African American, Hispanic, or Asian tester, sure, I'll show you the house in that zip code that you requested. But when a white applicant came in and asked to see houses in that same neighborhood, they'd say, well, it's okay, but you probably should consider living over here instead, right? So steering the white customer to a neighborhood they felt was more appropriate for that customer. They would also mention things like the crime rate and the types of schools and things like that, which the federal government has viewed as kind of code language, to say to white testers, no, you probably don't want to live over there because the crime rate is this compared to this, so this is where we're going to steer you over here. So that's one of the things they observed. And the last thing that they documented was the fact that in many instances, when the minority tester goes in, they would offer, 5 listings for them to consider. When the white tester goes in, they may offer them 15 different choices. So limiting the number of choices that they offered to a minority group. So those were all the types of fair housing violations that were documented by Newsday in this particular investigation. So now that we know that there is an issue, let's talk about the Fair Housing Act and how it relates to what was found in the Newsday article. Back in 1968, Congress initially enacted the Fair Housing Act. And at that time, they extended protections to race, color, religion, national origin. They amended it in 1974 to add sex as a protected class, because that's what we're talking about here, the list of protected class statuses. And then finally in 1988, they added handicap and familial status being discriminating against people with children, all right? So those are the current protected classes extended by the Fair Housing Act: race, color, religion, national origin, sex, handicap, sometimes you see disability, and familial status. There are sometimes additional protections extended on a state level. There are sometimes additional class protection extended on a local level. So sometimes you will see things like sexual orientation and gender identity, which, by the way, are also additional protected classes above and beyond what the federal government requires that are codified in your code of ethics. There's also a big issue with source of income in some of the counties here in Florida, South Florida in particular. I think Alachua is one of the most recent counties to consider it. Not sure where they are on that, but they are certainly looking at source of income. Age can be a protected class status, and also, interestingly enough, there are some counties that will extend protected class status to victims of domestic violence or dating abuse or stalking. So you have to not only look at what the state or the federal government requires, but also your state and local areas. If you're practicing in multiple counties, you would have to familiarize yourself with all of the protected class statuses in that county. And then remember, as realtors, you have the additional the additional responsibility of ensuring that you do not discriminate based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So we've already talked about some of the ways that you can discriminate: denying or limiting services, putting up those additional terms or conditions on a potential customer that you don't on others. Sometimes it's in the advertising itself, right? In source of income counties, we see people get in trouble all the time by saying no Section 8 required. Sometimes they'll say no kids allowed, and it's not a 55 plus community, it's just a regular community. So you have to be careful, not just in your behavior, but also in the advertisements. Make sure that you're not putting that coded language in there about schools and crimes and things like that, that people will often question as whether or not that's kind of subtle discrimination. And then steering based on the racial composition of the neighborhood. Don't assume that because somebody's Asian, they should want to live with everybody who's Asian or vice versa. You want to allow customers to dictate where they live and not have these kind of preconceived ideas. So that being said, I want to talk to you about how you address some of this. All right. And so I mentioned coded language. Check all of your advertisements to make sure there is no coded language. It is okay to provide a customer information about crime statistics and schools, but don't give them that. Don't be the source of that information. Be the source of the information. Give every customer a link to the school system where the schools are rated. Give every customer a link to the sheriff's department for their crime statistics. Don't give it to some and not to others. Just make it a part of your business process for all of your customers. Okay. You want to make sure that you have sound business policies. You want to document things like this. If you're a broker, provide this link that's recorded to your agents and say, hey, govern yourselves accordingly. Make sure that you're making it clear in your office how you will handle situations like this. Now, that said, where are we today with the Long Island situation? Well, you don't want to be like the brokers in Long Island. These are some really large franchises, big names, so to speak, in the real estate industry. And the update that I want to give you about that is that the Senate in the state of New York has called for $12 million in appropriation for fair housing and enforcement. Fair housing and enforcement. So now that the really highly publicized problem is undeniable, the state of New York is saying we need to do more to enforce fair housing, right? The Senate in the state of New York also issued 31 subpoenas to these brokerages for them to testify in front of one of the committees there for the New York Senate. You definitely don't ever want to be that broker who's on the receiving end of a subpoena from your state legislature, okay, about your business practices. So I suspect there will probably be litigation that comes out of this as well. So that's potentially a huge problem. So that is obvious discrimination, right? We all get that. Protected class status, that happens. We know how to guard against that. What I want to talk to you about is a little bit more subtle discrimination that is not intentional. It is unintentional, because you are very likely not going to ever be on the receiving end of any intentional discrimination claim. What scares me and keeps me up at night is when our brokers here in Florida are sued for unintentional violations of fair housing. Now, I'm going to talk about this topic. I've talked about it before. You may have heard me talk about it at one of the legal updates or at convention or midwinter. But I'm going to talk about it again because it's back. Criminal history screening for tenants, right? A couple years ago, and actually this started in 2018. And in 2019, January 2019, we noticed a trend in brokers here in Florida being sued. And they were sued because they have property management division or leasing divisions, and the agent in that division would get a phone call, just a phone call, from a gentleman by the name of Mr. Chambers. And Mr. Chambers would ask the agent, you know, I've applied for 5 properties. I've been denied every time. You see, I have a criminal history. I've been in trouble in years. I work hard. I pay my bills. I pay my rent on time, but I need to move. And nobody has given me a chance because I have a criminal history. I see you have these properties listed. Can you just tell me, so I don't waste another application fee, whether or not I'll be approved for a rental with a criminal history? And the property managers who would fall for the sob story would oftentimes say things like, well, you know, you probably want to try another office. We have some pretty stringent requirements when it comes to background screening of tenants. Y'all, that's the lawsuit. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, at the time in 2019, I put up, and whenever I do this, I put up a screen that says, here are 30 lawsuits that were filed in the last 6 months because of this screening of tenants for criminal histories. And so because of that, I set up an alert on our kind of version of tracking cases. And what I have noticed is during this COVID crisis, Mr. Chambers is back. Mr. Chambers and his attorney, the same attorney, has filed 7 lawsuits in the last 10 days. This is right now information. So you're the first people I'm sharing this with. Mr. Chambers and his lawyer are calling brokerage offices again. So while we talked about this before, here's what I know. On average, about 2,300 sales associates enter this profession every month, on average. And though I talked about this a lot in the early part of 2019, 2,300 times 6 or 8, that's a lot of new sales associates. So some of you may not have heard this information. So I'm going to cover it again really quickly because I want you to understand what the issue is. Mr. Chambers is relying on guidance that was issued by HUD back in 2016, which said, listen, here's what we know in this country. We know that our criminal justice system has had a disparate impact on minorities. So this is the disparate impact theory. Disparate impact means the violation of fair housing is not intentional. You are not discriminating on the face of it against someone who is a member of a protected class, because being someone with a criminal history is not defined as a protected class. But if minorities have had made up a disproportionate share of the criminal justice system, by denying people with criminal histories, you are inadvertently discriminating against a protected class. That's what disparate impact means. It is not intentional. It is just disparate impact. So that was 2016. That is literally cited as guidance in these lawsuits. So what are you saying, Juana? Are you saying I cannot deny a tenant based on criminal history? Not what we're saying. Not what HUD said. And since that 2016 guidance, HUD has issued new disparate impact rules to try to address some of this. But even since then, obviously, Mr. Chambers and his attorney are prepared to still file lawsuits against brokerages here in Florida. NAR issued guidance in the face of the HUD guidance, and here's what they say you do. You may deny someone based on, the owner may deny someone based on criminal history if that person poses a legitimate threat to the health, safety, and welfare of a community or the property. If their criminal history happens to be arson, probably not the person you want to rent a property to. If they are a sex offender and there are children next door, probably not the person you want to rent a property to. But here's what you have to remember. Every situation has to be assessed case by case. Someone who bounced a check for over $300 10 years ago before banks realized they could make a lot of money and insufficient fund fees by giving you a little overdraft protection is probably charged with a felony, right? Doesn't mean that they have developed excellent credit since then, have a stable employment history, have a stable rental history, but they may have been charged because it was $310 with felony worthless check. So you can't just treat all felonies the same. What you don't want to have in your office is absolute bans for people with criminal history. You want to look at your applications. You want to make sure that you're asking them about their specific criminal history, not whether or not they were arrested, but whether or not a court actually said, we're going to find you guilty or allow you to plead no contest and sentence you. So check your forms. Do you ask about arrest? If so, stop. Ask only about convictions or pleas to crimes. You want to develop sound policies for how you will assess this and treat every applicant the same. Okay. And then what you as a realtor want to do is summarize that information, provide it to your owner, and have the owner make the decision. Sorry. Okay. So that's what you want to do. And you would think I would have remembered to charge my iPad before I started talking, but I didn't. So if you will excuse me for just a moment, I'm going to grab my charger cord. Thank you.
As Joanna's going to go grab her cord, do you have any questions as you're listening to her presentation? You may feel free to just type them into the chat box at the very end of her presentation. We will go ahead and answer some of those questions and have a dialogue about that as well. Char, did you have?
Yeah, I actually had something else to say real quick. The wire fraud, be sure that you guys are paying a lot of attention to the wiring directions. Right now, everybody's wiring money, and the wire fraud is up big time. So be sure, as we all should do anyways, that your buyers have wiring instructions and that they know that they should call the title company and be sure that these are indeed the wiring instructions.
Thank you for that little title tip.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So y'all, I am good at many things, but I will tell you, I have learned, as I shared earlier, I am not good at teaching my child, and I am not good at technological challenges. So I appreciate you bearing with me as I get all plugged in here. All right. As I was saying, treat everybody equally in terms of the process. Train your agents to recognize that they should consider the age of the conduct in question. They should also consider any evidence of good rental history, because that's really the best predictor as to whether or not the person is going to be a good tenant. Stable employment, and any rehabilitative efforts that the person has had in their life since that time. Maybe they had a drug problem and they've been sober for 20 years, right? You want to consider all of those things, package that, give it to the landlord, let the landlord make the decision. And then you communicate back to the tenant whether or not they are approved based on the landlord's decision. Now, right here, I always get a hand up when I'm presenting this information in public, and the person will say, yeah, but the association said. One of the things we noticed about the landlord or the lawsuits that Mr. Chambers and his attorney filed, they will file the lawsuit against the association just as quick as they will the real estate agent. So make sure this is where you become the source of the source and not the source yourself. If you follow that guiding principle, you'll be just fine. But communicate whatever the landlord and the association's decision is with respect to this issue. And make sure your agents know that Mr. Chambers is, as we are I'm sure, calling a real estate office, because in the time of COVID, he has decided that the thing to do is collect a paycheck from real estate brokerages here in Florida. So be careful. Last thing I'm going to say really quickly about fair housing, because it's one that falls under fair housing, but most people don't think about it in those terms, is emotional support animals. Now, if I was in front of you, I would pause for dramatic effect, because there would be a collective moaning of pain throughout the room from our members who absolutely hate this topic. And I get it. I understand there's not a lot of clarity in terms of what you do and don't do, even with the new guidance that HUD issued recently on this issue. What I want you to remember is there are two types. The federal government views this as support animals, not just the assistance animals. They don't really use the term, emotional support animal or service animal. They kind of collectively call these assistance or support animals. Service animals are trained dogs and miniature horses, and the protection for a service animal comes from the Americans with Disabilities Act. Emotional support animals, the protection comes from the Fair Housing Act. So when I mentioned earlier that there are these protected classes, and I said the third wave of changes for the Fair Housing Act, they added disability. That is where the protection for people, emotional support, peacocks, alligators, insects, ducks, all of that comes from the Fair Housing Act. So I just want you to understand with respect to emotional support animals, I'm sure you've heard this presentation before, so I won't get into all the details because I want to leave time for questions. I want you to understand where that protection comes from. This is another area where you don't have to intend to discriminate, but the fact that an emotional support animal is denied to someone making that request could be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. All right. So remember, do not ask for medical documentation for these emotional support animals. You can ask for a letter from a guidance counselor. It's not a guidance counselor. Sorry, I'm stuck. 1 minute I'm the teacher, the next minute I'm the lawyer. From a social worker or from a doctor, a therapist, a psychologist. You may ask for documentation in the form of a letter. That letter does not have to tell you their diagnosis. That letter does not have to specify the particular animal. It just needs to say the person is entitled to an emotional support animal based on a disability. That's it. No medical documentation can be requested. When they make that request of you, again, do not make the decision. Give that information to the landlord. If the landlord denies the person, the association denies the person the emotional support animal, that's on them. Communicate their decision to that customer, but do not take it upon yourself to decide whether or not the emotional support animal is appropriate or necessary for this person. All right. So that's my presentation on fair housing. Are there any questions I can answer about fair housing or anything else?
We do have a question from Jean Durazio. She asks, if you suspect a buyer or a seller is a tester, can you ask them if they are, and are they required to answer?
So thank you for that question, Jean. Can you ask them? Sure, you can. There's nothing prohibiting you from asking them that. I'm also not aware of anything legally that forces them to answer that question in the affirmative, right? If you suspect you're dealing with a tester, just, be really, really careful. If you're an agent, I might even say to that person, particularly if you're in the office or you have your broker available to you, hold on for just a moment. I need to go check on something. Go talk to your broker. Go in the other room, call the Florida Realtor Legal Hotline while they're sitting there if you like. But just know that what you really want to do is on the front end, insulate yourselves with good sound policies, good forms that are not asking discriminatory questions or using code words, so that as you're talking to this person, you are already doing all of the right things compliant with your policy to ensure that you're not kind of stepping in it, right? So just try to be as proactive on the front end with respect to how you're going to handle customers. And then on the back end, if you feel like the person may be a tester, you can ask that question, but part of what concerns me about that, you might offend them, right? And so whereas before, you were just talking to a member of a minority group with a little bit of suspicion, now you're accusing them of something. At best, you're going to lose a customer. At worst, you might end up having them say, well, I file a fair housing complaint against you now because you asked me because I'm a minority person whether or not I'm a tester. So I would not encourage it. Just be very good, careful in how you handle your customers.
We have another question. So during this time of the COVID-19, I read in the Florida Realtors News the other day that there was some tips and tricks as to working with buyers and sellers during COVID-19 and questions that you are able to ask and things that you should stay away from. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Different ideas for our members?
Yeah, this is a good point as well. I'm glad you brought that up because while it is not commonly the case, there is at least one state in the U.S., and I can't remember which one, so I could pass that information along to you, but there's at least one state that has extended fair housing protections to folks with COVID-19. Now that surprises us because typically when you think about disability, you think about kind of a long-term enduring kind of state of being, right? Is it possible to be disabled and then get past that? Sure. But typically it's not something like a virus that is going to hopefully pass in a month or however long for each individual patient. So you definitely want to be careful because while Florida and most states have not extended that protection to COVID patients, you want to be very careful about two things. You don't want to violate anyone's kind of medical privacy rights by asking them a whole bunch of questions about what's your temperature and what's your this and what's your that. Sure, ask them if they have COVID, if you feel you need to, but I think this is one of those situations where all of this is going to be looked at by courts a year from now. There's no precedence legally to help us know how courts will view this or how the Department of Justice will view alleged discrimination. So I would avoid asking those questions if at all possible. Now, if you have to, don't ask medical questions. And here's the thing I also want you to avoid. I want you to avoid disparate impact here because we have seen isolated reports, obviously, of people of Asian descent being asked questions where those same questions are not being asked of other potential tenants in particular is where we're seeing it. So you want to avoid disparate impact. If you're going to ask questions, you need to ask those questions of all the customers, not just ones of Asian descent. And if you suspect someone like a tenant is, let's say they're coming from a COVID hotspot, you need to be very careful that you're not violating their HIPAA by asking them whether or not they've been tested for COVID.
Great, thank you. I love how you said, don't be the source, be the source of the source. And keeping an eye on what is happening on the state, local, and national level, and what are those protected classes. Where would you suggest we find the information on the local level about protected classes?
Yeah, that's the tough one, right? Because typically on a state level, we don't monitor all of the various local ordinances. So if I had to find the definitive place, I would go to the actual language of the ordinance for my county or my city. But I understand that can be a bit burdensome. Not so much if you only, if you really if you're limited in terms of where you practice to a county or two, or maybe 3 counties, it's not that burdensome to track that. But if you go beyond that, then yeah, I mean, it's tough to keep up with. We're seeing that with the local orders, right, for the various counties in terms of closures and non-essential. It is very difficult to take the governor's order and pair that with the local order and interpret it because they're constantly changing. The fair housing protected classes are not going to constantly change that much for where you operate primarily. For me, the best source that I've seen thus far for tracking that is ironically, the Apartment Association of Florida. They actually have a list on their website of all the counties and the protected classes for each. We have linked to that before on our Florida Realtors webpage. So if you cannot find it on our webpage, then check the Apartment Association's webpage.
Excellent. Another question that we just received is, who should members contact if there is a suspicion of fair housing discrimination? Where do they start?
So as a member, if you suspect violations of fair housing, you could do a couple of things. First of all, there's the Code of Ethics for our world, right? Code of Ethics has the article, I believe it's 10, going off the top of my head, that deals with protected class statuses and our responsibilities within the realtor world to not discriminate. So the first thing you could consider doing is a complaint to your local association, okay? That's our practice world. The Florida Real Estate Commission, interestingly enough, they typically do not investigate fair housing violations. And what I mean, the reason I say that, what I mean by that is, it's not that it's not important to them. It is that they typically are not in a position to prove up a violation of fair housing. So what they typically do when they get a complaint for fair housing is they will forward it to, now fair housing is under the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. HUD used to take those complaints, but now I believe CFPB does. And so ultimately the Department of Justice will determine whether or not there is a fair housing violation. If there is, then the Real Estate Commission will then take those findings and they could then take action against the person for violating a duty imposed by law. So that's how that typically works in a FRAC world. The other thing is you can certainly file that complaint with the federal government for fair housing. They get tons of them. At one point last year, when we first started looking at the emotional support animal thing, through the first 6 months of 2019, they had received over 1,000 complaints for emotional support animal fair housing violations alone. So it is definitely something that's on their radar, and they will be looking at that very closely, the way that they have been throughout 2019.
Great. And we've had a few people asking a little bit more about service animals and emotional support animals. I do want to let everybody know I do have a class coming to the calendar. It's going to be a webinar specifically dedicated to working with emotional support and service animals. We have another attorney that will be teaching on that class. So if you are interested, it's going to be coming to the calendar, I believe, today. So make sure that you get registered. It's going to be early May. So we're just working out the final details with that instructor as well. And do we have any other questions for Ms. Watkins before she heads off? Do you have any final words for our members?
I just want to thank you all. Listen, these are tough times, very uncertain times, and we are here for you. Florida Realtors is open for business because we want you to be open for business. If you have questions that we can answer, if you have products or services or tools that you need during this COVID crisis, please reach out to us. Again, some things that we get, we're not the source of, right? We don't process unemployment claims, but we understand the need for our members to be able to get their unemployment claims submitted. And so we are constantly working with state agencies, and NAR is working with federal agencies, and we're working with NAR to try to bring you what you need. And so please consider us a resource in these difficult times. I thank you for everything that you're doing to safely conduct business so that you can continue to be a resource for your customers. And y'all be safe and let us know how you need us.
Great. And I'm just reading one more question that we have.
Absolutely. Use me while you got me. Use me while you got me.
I got one more for you. So what if an applicant who provides a letter for an emotional support animal uses a fraudulent person posing to be a doctor, social worker, etc.? Can you deny, or do you take the letter as it is? Can you ask any additional questions about that?
So this gets to the heart of something that the federal government knows is an issue, Florida knows is an issue, that you can, in some instances, go online, pay $99 and get a letter. Okay, we know it's happening. The federal government, in a session in the fall of 2018, I sat in a session where one of the FBI department, well, actually he was with the Department of Justice, one of their prosecutors says, we know this is happening, right? And so subsequent to that, they have issued guidance that kind of tries to address this, but primarily there was a bill that passed this year during the Florida legislature, and they hope to tighten up controls as it relates to the relationship between the receiving party of that letter and the drafter of that letter. to try to establish that there needs to be some pre-existing relationship between them. Now, that bill has not yet been signed into law, so we don't know what's going to happen there. We just know at this point it has passed. We will see what happens and keep you posted. But even in the absence of all of that, here's what I suggest you do. Don't investigate to try to figure out the veracity of the information that's being given to you. You give that letter to the landlord. If the landlord wants to go out and investigate the veracity, that's their prerogative. Now, listen, I know what the landlord's going to say. The landlord's going to say, this is why I have you, because this is your area of expertise, right? But please be careful, because the Mr. Chambers of the world are real testers. They are legitimate, whether it is a news outlet using them, or the attorney here in Florida that's using Mr. Chambers and other testers. Do not go out and investigate. Accept it for face value. If it is from a doctor, it does specify that the animal is needed. Accept it. A doctor, social worker, or a psychologist, right? Accept it and provide that information to the owner. Do not investigate whether it's true or false.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about fair housing. And it's such a timely topic in this month of fair housing. And thank you for taking the time. I know you're kind of running a dual working environment here with being a teacher, being a lawyer. It's like, who am I today? So we really, really appreciate you taking the time. And to all of our GTR members who joined us today, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you. Greater Tampa Realtors is doing our best to provide you up-to-date information with regards to COVID-19, as well as fair housing and all of the different topics related to real estate. So we're constantly working on trying to get as many resources on the calendar for classes, for webinars, and just remember that we are just a click or a call away. Even though we're working from afar, you can't come visit us. You can always give us a call, shoot us an email. We have our live chat option up. Anything that you guys need, please just let us know. We're always here for you. Thank you so much, Juana. And
absolutely.
Bye,
y'all.
Thank you.